Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you're listening. In this episode, I'm chatting with Bob Athwal. Now, I've worked with Bob quite a few years ago when he worked at RWE Empower. He's been in the recruitment space for a number of years. He's also been university side as well. So he brings a whole wealth of experience that he's bringing to our conversation today. So we're talking about the early career space and early careers marketing, and in terms of what's been happening now, what are his views on what that means for early careers marketing over this decade. Let's get on with the chat. Hi Bob, how you doing?
Oh, good, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks for joining. It's been a while. We've been talking about having this episode, so it's great to get you on the podcast. Where are you calling from? What part of the world are you semi-locked down in?
Semi-locked down in North Hampshire. So I am sitting at my house in Basingstoke.
Good stuff. And how's things been? You've been keeping busy?
Yeah, I mean, busy. I suppose doing everything that everyone else is, Chris. So I've had to juggle, getting reacquainted with the family and dinner times and all of that kind of stuff, and not having a commute.
Yeah.
Online teaching, and kind of homework and homeschooling, all that stuff, and being on the couch watching everything on Netflix to kind of exercising like mad, everything above.
And the reason I wanted to kind of have a chat with you on the podcast is because we started working with each other quite a long time ago when you were during your Empower or RWE Empower days back in the day, and you've been both client side agency or client side, supplier side, and also you've been in the university space. So it'd be good to kind of share for those people not fully in the know about Bob, kind of a bit about your background. Really good to hear.
Yeah. Fortunately, I am still here, and and as you've said, I've been on all sides of our sort of, I suppose, sector. So most of my career, I've been an employer in RWE. I was head of graduate schemes there, which obviously is a big German utility. So ranging from engineers and sort of commercial grads to sort of business grads to kind of risk modelling grads, etc. But prior to that, I was at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which I think most people will know, and again, a general management scheme. Went to a client side, sort of supplier side of services. So I went to graduatejobs.com. And then I've also, as you pointed out, worked in the university sector as well. So I was at the University of Leicester, where I was director of student experience and careers was one of my teams. And my current job is I am kind of leading the conversations for race and early careers at Skyscanner. So I've been around. Nice. And been around on all sides.
That's good. That's such an interesting mix, I think, and I think it's perfect for the chit chat for today's episode. And I wanted to talk about really, obviously the last 8 to 10 months, there's been a whole lot of change. This decade, I've mentioned it before in previous episodes, but this decade was always going to be some big things happening. But I think a decade that's quote kickstarted by crisis, is probably going to change even more. So I wanted to talk about kind of start with talking about the early careers marketing landscape and like really how much is what that's happened over the last, say, 8 months has really changed the early careers marketing landscape. How have you found kind of graduate recruiters during COVID-19 in terms of prepping for the new recruitment season when students were meant to be fully back on campus, etc.?
Yeah, I think, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm just going to kind of put on my, I suppose, elder statesman hat on and kind of, the work that I've been doing around the sort of international network of employers and university career services, which is a non-profit venture that that features all the associations from around the world in graduate employability or university career services. And I'm going to kind of use that as probably the basis of the conversations that I've been having with
Yeah,
graduate
nice.
recruiters. And I think,
Yeah.
it's more of a global context as well. And that's because
Mm.
my role at Skyscanner is a global role. And so there are different networks that I'm plugged into that kind of has meant that, particularly around COVID, as it's a global pandemic, that different parts of the world have been responding differently, because at different times they've had a different wave, or the initial wave and then subsequent wave, and so you're starting to get a picture of how COVID is manifesting itself, and then what has been the response in different markets, and what can you use from those markets to kind of address your challenges, whether it's the UK, whether it's Spain, where it may ever that challenge may be. And I think the recruiters have been really interesting, because I think the great win was probably the fact that it was relatively easy for most to pivot to an online solution. And I think an online solution being obviously internships, which was in the Northern Hemisphere, the first kind of casualty, because don't forget, in the Southern Hemisphere, they were almost at the end of their academic year. So, so they were already kind of dealing with certain things. And I think that has been the great win, is the fact that internships still went or continued, and actually employers kind of bent over backwards as best as they could to try and give that to give
No worries.
employers bent over backwards to try and still continue those opportunities for the class of 20. And I think through that experience, it's opened up other conversations around access and scale and reach. And I think what I mean by that is that all of a sudden technology has given us the ability to go more places, to scale up attendance. And so there's a number of tactics that I think recruiters have suddenly learned and found much more useful in this COVID environment than they would have anticipated. Because when you're a team of 2, 3, 4, 5, or sometimes more recruiters, you're spread always thin. So I think that's kind of been an interesting conversation with the recruiters that I've had.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's I think always is this challenge of having to do more with less, and I think actually what's happened now is that, sure, do you think like maybe the changes now have basically been like 4 years in 5, 6, 7, 8 months? It's been that accelerated.
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly the virtual environment, kind of doing stuff virtually, I think has absolutely, we've probably gained, as you said, 4 years in a matter of months than we would have done if it had naturally, organically occurred.
What so what kind of, in terms of what's happening right now, so let's say in the Northern Hemisphere, typical time of year is where, God, I remember from experience, being on the milk round and going to multiple events, talking to multiple career services and doing careers fairs and presentations, and that kind of end of October is usually actually around this time of the year, this time of the month was where you had multiple events on at the same time in multiple locations. So how have recruiters kind of prepared for that? Have they kind of held out to kind of see what was going on with universities, or have they been kind of right from the off planning a different approach?
I think it's a mixed picture, Chris. I think there are there are certain sectors that are clearly more, I suppose, hit more badly by the pandemic than others. And my own sector, one of them, travel. But I think there are other sectors that have clearly been winning. Whether you look at retail in terms of and logistics and operations. And I think for some organisations where there's been that kind of certainty and clarity, I think it's kind of almost business as usual. I think the real story that's emerging, and I suspect there will be in the UK, the ISC will share some research that they were doing. But I think what you'll see is that there's probably a good number of employers that just haven't committed beyond a certain point. So what I mean by that is, I think the landscape shifted a little bit around people recruiting in waves. So if annually their number target used to be, I don't know, 50 or more or whatever it might be, but actually releasing vacancies or opportunities in phases, because the business is changing constantly. And I think you've just got to look at what's happening in the UK right now around, the three-tier system of lockdowns. And I think that in itself is presenting challenges for businesses to really plan long term, and I don't think they can. And the last thing any business wants to do is not fulfill a promise that they make to students, particularly through their early careers programs, whether it's an internship or graduate program. So I think they've been a bit more cautious, and I think then there are a few organisations and certainly in some sectors that they just can't make that they just can't get to that decision just yet.
It's interesting actually then for me when you say that, that then means that actually what you've got to do is you've got to be able to kind of generate the demand without necessarily having all the vacancies there. So that very much for me points towards kind of growing that kind of massive bench of potential talents that then when you're ready to release roles, make available positions, then you can dip into that bench, that pool. So for me that kind of moves it away from, I'm not saying this is across the board, but there is often, I think, is been about focusing on how great early career programs are and come and join us and this is what you'd be doing, to actually going, let's treat it as actually a real talent pool of people where we get them aware of these organizations, generate an engagement, give them advice, share those stories that are going to either create that sense of empathy or be that inspiration for somebody, to help them prepare that person for when they are ready to join, to be I suppose the best kind of candidate that they can be. So that for me kind of then moves it more towards a content marketing model where, okay, we don't necessarily have products, or in this case vacancies available now, but we want to develop a relationship with you, and if you haven't got vacancies, what do you talk about? For me, you apply content marketing to it.
No, I think you're right. I think the smart employers are having that conversation around ensuring that they're trying to upskill in terms of knowledge and information students on campus around what their organizations do in their industries are kind of being challenged with, or the opportunities. But I think it's also been interesting because as you started to do more of those types of relationship content and marketing, the other thing that I think is starting to emerge really powerfully is the students asking, or challenging the organizations, challenging us to kind of say what our ethics and values and what our stance is, particularly around social equity. And that's been a real shift, and a real shift of this decade, there's no doubt, and the movement that is Black Lives Matter.
So that's on that. I mean, we talked about before about just before we start recording about how organizations are addressing that, and the classic thing of changing logo and to show you're part of something and kind of doing something without necessarily showing the action. So do you think that's how much of a thing is that now as part of employer marketing, and does it change it from being just classic diversity advertising, diversity and inclusion advertising?
No, I think the train has well and truly left the station on this conversation. I think it's no longer, I don't think you can use diversity and inclusion and belonging as a catch-all. I genuinely think the organisations are going to truly have to work harder, because if you look at the way the students are responded, in terms of what's been asked of them, employers it'd be really interesting to see what those new skills are that are emerging. So for years, we've often talked about commercial awareness or resilience or, flexibility, analytical problem solving, et cetera, but actually more and more of the skills that employers are asking students to have is sort of cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, how you kind of work with others, how you kind of thrive in diverse teams, et cetera. And I think if an organization is just paying lip service to their inclusion and diversity agenda, they really are going to come unstuck. And I think that is a real shift, which is why I think the trainers have well and truly left the station, and rightly so, to kind of challenge us as employers, but also to ensure that we are, standing by some sort of action or call to action or a series of actionable changes that enable social equity. And I think that is kind of what I think this COVID-19 positive upside is, albeit it's been quite a tragic way to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's often though it's through such such significant crises comes that innovation, doesn't it, and that real change, as opposed to it potentially maybe lip service being paid to something. I think in so many ways that companies are really realizing the importance of really, I suppose, getting the right talent in and looking after your employees, because fundamentally that's, if you don't have your employees, you don't have your customers, do you? You don't have a successful business. So I think it's really exciting, albeit coming from challenging times for sure, and very sad times, what's going to happen over this decade. Certainly hoping that we're going to be seeing a lot more going on. I've actually seen something with so to kind of go back to the early careers space, I've seen Accenture launched a couple of weeks ago their Accenture Live, which is their schedule of events, and they're calling it their digital campus, which is great. And they've got such a wide variety of content there, which people can join and listen to live or access on demand. I'm hoping to have a conversation with someone involved in that actually in the next couple of episodes actually. So what have you seen kind of, it's kind of still, it's relatively early days in terms of the kind of the core part of the milk round, but have you seen anything that's particularly stood out for you from early careers marketing, what companies are doing at the moment?
I would say that the thing that's really stood out for me, and it's funny you mentioned the Accenture one, I think, the team, Joan and the team down there, that they've obviously done a really good job in terms of trying to be engaging and trying to be more far-reaching. I think I've similar vein. I think, you just got to kind of look at the sort of LinkedIn really, and you'll see, various employers, whether it's, Virgin Media or Johnson & Johnson or whoever it might be, actually, they're all kind of starting to take that approach to try and be a bit more accessible, a bit more scalable. And again, that's something that the pandemic has given us, is the fact that, we're able to get to students in parts of, certain universities or certain parts of the country that perhaps historically we wouldn't have got to, or not as easily as if we had got to. But I think the other thing that it's done, and some of the things that I've really seen that, I think a number of the law firms, again, Clifford Chance are doing some really cool stuff, is, which again is not surprising because, law is quite an innovator in my view. I think if you look at the way that they've taken a more human approach, and this has been always one of the challenges for me in terms of, losing that human approach in the marketing agenda to try and reach students. And having worked in a university, I can tell you it's quite tiresome when you start to see various campaigns that had been coming out from employers, because they were all kind of, you could hide the logo, and and the brochure or the website and everything else was all kind of pedestrian and vanilla.
Yeah.
And I think, what's happened here is with some of these great organisations with colleagues that lead them, they're starting to think about the students. They're starting to also care about the students, or show that they're caring through their communication channels. So they might actually be talking about, do you have access, for example, to equipment to access their events, for example, or when they run those events, being a bit more thoughtful. So not necessarily we're running these things at this certain time and blah blah blah, but actually asking the students, when is it a good time for you to come online to have a conversation, or attend our insight, or here's some mindfulness that you may want to think and access, because obviously the pandemic is as we know is having the effect on all of us, whether it's mentally or physically. Everyone's kind of going through it, and I think that for me has been the real smart stuff. Great responses that I've seen from some of those employers is that caring component.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely right. And I think that is a massive tick in the box of content marketing, where you are starting off by, you've got thinking about the audience is so often used in marketing, isn't it? And it's like, well, of course you think about the audience, but it's actually, not just demographically, but, psychographically, if I've said that right, actually understanding what is it we can give, the people we want to engage with to make their lives easier. And I think that's so relevant to early careers marketing, when people are making one of their first few steps into the world of work, and employers are in a massive position, capability to actually offer that support, and while doing that as well, learning more about the people they want to engage with, their target audience, but also them learning more about those organizations. You kind of build that rapport, over years. And actually, a relationship you have with a brand, with an employer brand, could be a whole lifetime, could be a whole career, couldn't it? Where you could argue with some consumer brands, you say, well, maybe it's not such a thing, but to actually have a relationship with an employer brand over your whole career is entirely possible. Where you might join them at one point, leave them, and join them again, especially as the workforce demands become more agile, I think, in terms of where you're working and who you're working for.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, nice. And do you think what's been happening with COVID, that do you think you've touched on it, some of it already, but do you think that actually the milk round, the campus recruitment, campus marketing model has kind of changed for good? Do you think some things will come back, or is it we're going to be seeing people moving more online, but maybe blending it with physical, in-person events when that time is possible?
I don't know, if I'm honest, Chris. My hope is there is a change, and there's a step change, because as I've said, it was a good few years since the last time I was an employer and coming back onto this side of the fence. And actually it was quite depressing in some ways to come back and see that very little had changed. And unfortunately, the only thing that really had changed is that a number of my sort of peers and former colleagues or colleagues of that ilk had kind of all moved on to different things, and there was less experienced people in early careers. So you very rapidly suddenly start to become one of those lifers, and there's a few of us, don't get me wrong, but there used to be so many big personalities, characters, and there seemed to be less of those, and it seemed to become more of almost I suppose just a process, a transactional process, that people were running their early careers programs with people that literally were kind of hop on, hop off type of sort of 18 months, 2 years. And I think for me, the hope is that with this pandemic, that we will see a re-emergence from organizations to actually want to develop people, particularly graduates and students, young people generally, around, you know, how to help their organizations be fit for this new kind of future. And the economy will come back, there's no doubt about it, always will. But it's just about the time factor. But you need smart people to help you to engage in different ways and fresh ways, in ways that are perhaps alien to people that have been in the workplace for a number of years, which is what students have always given organizations, you know, that fresh thinking, that kind of reverse mentoring, and so on. And I think why I'm hoping it will change is because I don't want it to be transactional anymore. It's got to be transformative. And so the way graduate recruiters can impact is to be more transformative and kind of conversations and development focus, which doesn't always necessarily give you an immediate return. And that's the thing that I think has happened, is that the transactional component of a process meant that you were having to justify that there was an immediate return, and actually there's a long game to be had in terms of people here and people's development and the organizational kind of fit for future stuff. And that's where I'm hoping, you know, people will take that approach, because that's the way that they'll survive in terms of operating early careers programs, because that will be always the question that many recruiters ask is, how do I continually justify the existence of the early careers programs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you've almost got to take a step back and to be more developmental, because otherwise we're in danger. And I think there are a number of employers that are thinking this. I think the danger is we're going to have a generation of students that may feel like they've been robbed of opportunities because of COVID if we do not help them and support them with our experience, our knowledge, and our kind of, you know, guidance. And just accept that, you know, it's not always going to be an immediate return, but whether people have got the experience in the current sector in terms of being able to have that conversation or navigate that type of conversation in their organizations, I don't know, Chris.
I think there isn't the role or the roles connected to what we've been talking about will surely be, or hopefully be, elevated that much more, you know, in terms of how important it is with the success of an organization. Whereas, you know, previously maybe, you know, it has been sometimes about chasing the application numbers and, you know, making sure you've got more applications than, say, someone, you know, some other organizations, and treating it more transactionally. Whereas if there is more of a view on the long term, and, you know, talking about, you know, investors who are, you know, want to invest in organizations that have a long-term view on things, and really thinking about how they look after their employees and the social impact that organization has, then surely that interest from investors will trickle down from board level all the way throughout the whole organization, won't it? So hopefully, you know, what we're talking about will be elevated more, so that people do take more of a long-term view in it.
Yeah, no, I hope so. I think it's needed, and I guess that was the sort of point I was trying to make around, you know, the loss of experience, let's say, since my sort of return of you know, what was a gap of 8-9 years being an employer again.
Was it that long? Wow, God, yeah, of course. You were at University of Leicester, weren't you? So
yeah, I was out of. I mean, I stopped being a graduate recruiter in 2010, because for 2010 to 12 I was a HR business partner. And then I went to University of Leicester at the start of 2012, and I finished my kind of university sort of life after Leicester even in 2018 and towards the end. So, you know, there was a good sort of 7-year gap where I was kind of in higher education, but then also doing my own consultancy services. So I think, you know, having then been, or returning back as an employer almost 8-9 years later, you know, that's the bit that I felt was missing or had shifted or had changed, is that transactional piece.
Yeah, I mean, I found that, so around that time, so especially when we used to work together, I was very much at the centre of kind of early careers recruitment, and, you know, working with universities, and you know, I'm less so now because I've diversified a lot over the last 10 years. But when I have touched back into it, I do notice that maybe there hasn't been as much acceleration and change and new things than maybe you'd expect. So I kind of in part, again, it's come from tough times with the last 6 months, but I'm hoping that the traditional model of marketing in the early career space is going to be kind of broken for good, which means it becomes something better for the rest of this decade and beyond.
Yeah, I think.
And go on.
No, I was going to say no. I think absolutely. I think, but it's all about relationships, Chris. Is what I was going to say. Is that I think the bit that I hope comes out of this as well is, despite you and I perhaps not speaking for a period of time, you're still able to pick up, an email or phone or whatever and say, "Hey, Bob, I'd love to pick your brains or do something." And I hope that in this kind of elevated status or resurgence and the shift, that those relationships that you and I and others have built over time, because we were in it and doing things and across the, whether it's universities, employers, I just hope that they have that same opportunity, because there's nothing like kind of using your network of people to kind of really help you navigate some of these things, especially when you've not faced something like this before.
Yeah, I was talking to Rob Fryer a few episodes ago. I think it's quite a few episodes ago now, actually. Of course, he's a University Leicester now, having been on the recruitment side of things for a good few years, and he mentioned about kind of how organizations, early careers, marketers, recruiters can maybe do things together as well, and get together and go, right, well, look, we're trying to do things as a sector here. Let's do something together to try and solve the problem. And there's still going to be plenty of people to fight over, so to speak, in a nice way, to fight over at the end of it. But let's do more collaboration, which is, I think, really interesting to hear from Rob's side of things. So I think that kind of stuff would certainly help. I think a lot more when there is more, is more collaboration between two things, doing things jointly to benefit everybody, rather than doing things separately.
Agreed. Totally agree with that. I think that's the bit is where, I think I referenced to you at the start before we recorded the the kind of movement that Laura, again at the Chancellor's, kick-started around the swag that employees dish out on campus, and how that could be better use of money, environment, and perhaps reach activities that really make an impact. Because within sort of the COVID-19 sort of landscape of early careers, there are those groups that are more disproportionately affected than others, and not everyone has Wi-Fi, latest machines to Zoom or Teams or Google Meet on, and so I think that's something that you've got to kind of only tackle together sometimes to be more powerful and effective.
Yeah, definitely. And we touched on some of this already, but let's kind of finish off with going, right, well, for people working in the early career space, kind of what advice would you give them for when they're thinking about their marketing over the next 12 months? Because I'm sure the next 12 months is still going to be a certain amount of flux and change and beyond that as well. So what kind of advice would you give people? Those people might be relatively early in their career. What should they do?
So for me, for recruiters, I would say get behind, really understand what your business's challenges are and what those opportunities are, and it's not going to be acceptable not to understand your business bottom line, and then to marry that up with the skill set and the value and ethics set of the people available to you in the marketplace, i.e. through universities. So working with the right universities, and when I say the right universities, I mean all universities that have the skills or developing the skills that your business needs. And it's not a group that are part of a particular, set of universities. Then the talent isn't just in those, there's talent everywhere. And it's really about making sure that you're a bit more thoughtful around your kind of pool of access. And that's one bit. The other bit for me is really around using the network and the professional body, the ISC and others like them around the world, and using your network again, to the last point around collaboration and kind of working together, and just being a bit more authentic, I would say, in their marketing, in their when I say authentic, what I mean by that is honest. That we're not quite sure what this new world looks like, but it will get better, and it will provide opportunities, and it will provide innovation, and some of that we just can't see just yet. But it will happen. It happened in the last recession, and it will happen again now. And I think we just need to kind of remember that, we will get through this, but if you work with others that can help you and collaborate with them, you'll get through it sooner.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where often, if not all the time, the best ideas come from, is where those half ideas are rubbing against other ideas. And, what comes from that is innovation, basically. And actually that thing of, so you touched on it already, actually, but yeah, that classic exercise of looking at your website, looking at any of your marketing collateral, covering the name and the logo, and going, right, is this us? Yeah. And is this any different to everyone else out there? So I think that's a classic way of doing things. I think that's always a good thing to do from time to time, is to kind of take a step back from your marketing and going, is this authentic to us, congruent to us, and is this actually different to what others are offering, and is it actually adding any kind of value? I'll say value, let's put some meat on the bones of it. Is it helping people make that right choice?
Agreed.
Nice, good stuff. Okay. Yeah, thanks for your time, Bob. I know you've been busy and stuff, but it's great to just take a bit of a step back and have a chat about these things. And have a good rest of the evening. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to follow or subscribe for the latest episode drops. And don't forget to get in touch if you want to contribute.